Welcome to Passion for Sound, the channel dedicated to thorough and honest reviews of headphones, earphones, DACs, headphone amps, other components and accessories. Basically everything audio related except power amps and passive speakers. My name's Lachlan and my goal is to explore and discuss all kinds of audio topics, even the controversial ones, to help us all find more enjoyment from music. Thanks for watching and enjoy the video. Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. Today we're looking at the Matrix Mini I Pro 3, but before I get to that, I just want to remind you that the giveaway is going on still for the Samsung Galaxy Buds Live here. If you haven't seen my last couple of videos, the way you enter this draw is pretty simple. Make sure you subscribe and then leave your comment below for a merchandise idea to go on something like a t-shirt or a hoodie. You don't have to come up with finished graphics or anything like that, just an idea or a concept that I can understand and then turn into something later. The winner of the giveaway will be based on what I think is the best idea, and they will receive this pair of Samsung Galaxy Buds Live as well as a t-shirt or hoodie, their choice, with the design that I've chosen as the winner, i.e. their idea. So if that sounds interesting to you, make sure you subscribe, hit that button now, and leave your comments below for a fun and audio-related merchandise idea. With that out of the way, let's start talking about the Mini I Pro 3. Now, I never quite know whether to call it the Mini I Pro 3 or the Mini i3 Pro. Technically, there are two ranges of Mini i3 from Matrix. There's the regular and there's the Pro version, and I'll talk about the differences in a moment. To get things quickly started off with an introduction though, these are both almost identical units. The one I've got here is the Pro version, and they retail for $855 for the standard and $1,025 for the Pro version. So the Pro version equates in Australian dollars to about 1,400 Australian if you're doing just a straight conversion from the US dollar amount. The product itself is both a DAC and also a very accomplished streamer with a built-in headphone amp. So on paper, it kind of looks like the perfect endgame all-in-one solution, but that was really what I was wanting to find out was, is it actually the perfect all-in-one solution, or are there a few gaps? And without giving too much away, I'll tell you that there are a few gaps, so make sure you watch right through this video because there's things that are great and things that are not so great when it comes to the Mini i3. I should also say a huge thanks to Appos Audio for sending me the Mini i3 Pro for this review. They are an affiliate for the channel, so I do get some income from any sales made, but as you'll see with this review, that doesn't colour my thoughts on the product because I'm going to tell you everything, warts and all, about the Mini i3 Pro. Before we get into the details, let me introduce it visually to you with a short glamour video. While I was preparing for this review, and after I'd done a lot of listening and testing of my own, I happened to watch some reviews on YouTube from other reviewers relating to this specific product. And I have to say one of them in particular did catch my attention for a statement made that I don't think is true, and I want to call out why, because I want there to be a balance of opinions and ideas across the internet for people reviewing these sorts of products. I don't mean this to be a shot at anyone, I'm not trying to start any kind of battle or disagreement, but one of the reviewers that I watched talked about the fact that all-in-ones like this are going to be the future of audio, and I strongly disagree. It's not that I don't like all-in-ones, I happen to love all-in-ones. They're really, really handy devices if you don't have a lot of space on your desk or if you're looking for a really simple and relatively affordable solution. The problem is, by cramming everything into a single case, you're almost always inevitably making compromises until you get to the extreme flagship type level devices such as a Chord Hugo TT2. It's very rare in my experience, in fact I don't think I've ever found an all-in-one that provides as good a performance as two separate devices. So I'm going to come back around to that and revisit it later, but I wanted to flag up front that I don't believe all-in-ones are the future. I do believe they're a fantastic product, but they're not better than separates. I don't think they're ever going to be better than separates because there are trade-offs, as I'll talk about soon. Another thing I noticed as I watched reviews was that one of the key flaws of the Mini i3 Pro was not discussed, in my opinion, in enough depth in some of the reviews that I watched. And there is a really key flaw with the Mini i Pro 3 that you do need to be aware of. So as I said before, make sure you do watch right through this. I'm not saying that to try and extend viewing time or anything like that, but because I think there's a lot to cover. This is quite a complex device in terms of all of the different things it does, and some of them it does incredibly well, some of them it doesn't do so well, and I think it's important that you understand all of them. So with that out of the way, let's start really talking now about what the Mini i3 series do, what the difference between the Pro and the non-Pro version are, and of course how it sounds, what the features, functions are, all of that sort of good stuff. To get things started, I think it's worth differentiating the Pro version from the standard version of the Mini i3 series. When you're buying the Pro, you're getting three key things that are different. One of them is MQA support. That may or may not be of any interest to you, but it's there in the Pro version. Another difference is that the Pro version uses a higher quality oscillator or timing chip. What that should mean in theory is better jitter performance, therefore a smoother sound with better timing accuracy. I haven't heard the Mini i3 and the i3 Pro side by side to say if that makes a difference, but in theory it should make the Mini i3 Pro the slightly more refined listen with a better sense of resolution, detail and space in the soundstage. It will be subtle, so I'm not suggesting it should be a massive decision-making item, but there is that difference there. The final key feature, and this could be a deal breaker for some people, or maybe not a deal breaker, but a decision maker for some people, is that the Mini i3 Pro here comes with Wi-Fi, whereas the standard Mini i3 does not have Wi-Fi and only has an RJ45 connection for network. So if you're relying on Wi-Fi for your streaming device, you will need to buy the Mini i3 Pro, even if you don't want MQA and you don't care about that oscillator chip being high quality. So they're the three differences. As I said before, this is the Mini i3 Pro. This is the top of the line, best oscillator chip. It has got Wi-Fi. It has got MQA. I'm not really going to touch on MQA in this review because it's one of those things that if you like MQA, it's there. If you don't like MQA, you probably don't care. It doesn't change the performance of the device significantly enough that it makes it worth buying with or without MQA. It should only come down to your listening tastes, which streaming services you use, and whether you like MQA. So now let's start talking about the design and the features, the connectivity, etc. of the Mini i3 Pro here. I'm going to start on the front panel because things are nice and simple there. We've got outputs for headphones, both a single-ended 6.5mm and a balanced 4.4mm Pentacon. We've then got this beautiful LED screen that provides lots of information and very easy access to the menu system. I love the screen and I love the display on this, particularly when it's playing back streamed items where you get to see the album art, the sample rate, the name of the album, the name of the artist. I just absolutely love seeing all that play back. And that for me is one of the biggest selling points of the Mini i3 Pro, is that if you are looking for a streaming solution all in one, it's a beautiful interface to use for that purpose. Coming further along the front panel, we've then got the control knob and the volume knob. It's a multifunction interface, as most of these sorts of products are. So you've got rotation for both volume or selection of menu items, and you've got a click button as well that acts for turning on the device, turning off the device, selecting the menu, or at least opening up the menu to choose which source you're using. All that sort of stuff is handled with that volume knob. The Mini i3 Pro does also come with a remote control, which is not a bad little remote control, but at the same time is slightly limited in functionality. And most importantly, the functionality that's missing from the Mini i3 Pro, both on the front panel and also on the remote, is the ability to access the settings menu. And that's buried around on the back. So let's take a look at that now. So on the back here, we've got lots of different inputs and outputs. I'm going to have to keep looking to remind myself what's there as we talk through what this does. The first things are pretty easy. We've got ourselves a pair of XLR outputs because this is both a DAC and preamp, so you can have fixed or variable levels coming out of the XLRs to feed a different headphone amp, a power amplifier, maybe you've got active speakers. All of those can be driven quite happily and very well through the XLR outputs. Next to that, we've also got a pair of RCA outputs. So again, you've got fixed or variable output through RCA for single-ended purposes. And then we've also got a pair of auxiliary inputs, RCA. So this is also able to act as a headphone amplifier if you've got some kind of other analog external device. In other words, you could have this set up to do all of your digital work and your streaming, but also to have your auxiliary coming from, say, a vinyl system into here to use the headphone amp on the front. So it's pretty good that that's there and it's quite versatile. I haven't given that a huge amount of testing because it's not something that I really have a need for or is set up for in my system here. It's nice that it's there and it does give the Mini i3 Pro lots of versatility. Moving out of the analog stage now, let's start talking digital. So we've got a coaxial SPDIF in, we've got a Toslink optical in, we've got I2S as well through HDMI, and there is the ability to change which version of I2S you're using because the pinouts can change on that, so you do have the choice with the Mini i3 Pro. We've then got the USB audio input, so that's for your USB DAC functionality using USB-C. We've got a LAN RJ45 connection, and we've got the antenna here for the Wi-Fi. So you've got lots and lots and lots of different inputs. One of the ones that we can't see here, which will also no doubt be under this cover I'm guessing, is the Bluetooth input. So this has every possible digital input I think I've come across except AES. So you've got optical, coaxial, USB, RJ45 LAN if you're using that in any way, and I2S. It's a very fully featured DAC with lots of inputs and great flexibility once again. The final two things I want to talk about, we've got a mains power connector, so that does mean that all of the power processing is done inside the device here. And then finally, we've got a little blue button there that you probably can't even see on this video because it's tiny. It's also hidden between the RJ45, the power cord, and the Wi-Fi antenna area here, so it's really hard to get to when you need to. And the problem with that is you often do need to if you want to adjust the settings, because this is the only way to access the settings menu in the Mini i3 Pro or the Mini i3 Standard. The problem with that is that it is something that I find I wanted to get to fairly regularly. For example, if you wanted to change from a fixed line out to a variable line out, you've got to press that blue button. If you want to try playing with the filters, you've got to press that blue button. Basically anything that goes beyond choosing which input you're using, you have to press that blue button to get to it. There are a few functions on the remote control that I mentioned earlier, so that as you can see here, there's quite a few buttons. So there are a few different functions you can get to through the remote, but for the most part, I found myself regularly having to reach for that blue button, and it's a real hassle. It's not quite a deal breaker because in many situations, you're going to set it up, you might play around with it for the first week or so, and then you'll settle into regular everyday use. But in the short term, it is really annoying, and not just because it's a little button on the back, but because of where it's located. By the time you plug in your RJ45 if you're using it, and also a power lead, it's very hard to get your finger in there and get enough kind of purchase on the button to give it a press. So I'm not a fan of that. It would have been great if they just put a little settings button somewhere on the front panel. It could have been equally small, it could have been black and basically invisible, but at least it would have been easy to get to. So that's going to be my first gripe against the Mini i3 Pro, and I do have a few to cover as we go through this. But it's not all bad. There's some really good stuff going on here, and as I said before, it is worth waiting to hear everything I have to say to work out if this is a device that's going to fit your needs and not have any deal breakers in some of the issues I'm going to raise. And so let's talk now about a couple more issues before I talk about a couple of things that I really like. One of the issues that I have, and it's quite a big issue with the Mini i3 Pro, is the headphone outputs on the front here. Not that it has headphone outputs, that's absolutely fantastic. They're also very well powered for an all-in-one device like this. Now, I'm not going to quote a power figure here because the power figures are quite varied. Depending on the impedance, the power does vary and range quite significantly and not in a kind of linear fashion. So with a lot of devices, if you've got, say, 3 watts at 8 ohms, you'll normally have 1.5 watts at 16 ohms, and then it halves every time you double the impedance, you halve the power output. In the case of the Mini i3 Pro, there's obviously a variation between the current and voltage delivery. That means the power outputs don't exactly follow that linear progression. So instead, what I'd recommend is that you click through one of the links below to check out the specs if you're concerned about the power output. What I will tell you though is that I've tried the Mini i3 Pro here with almost every headphone that I listen to regularly, which means things like the Focal Utopia, which is a 60 ohm from memory dynamic driver. I've tried it with the Meza Empyreans, which are a 30-something ohm planar that are also relatively easy to drive with no problems at all. I've also tried it with various other products like the Audeze LCD1, the Olo S4R and S4X when I was reviewing those recently. I've tried it with the HE400 SE that I reviewed just recently. So lots of different headphones have run through. And in fact, it drove every single headphone I tried it with in terms of power It drove them just fine, with the exception being the Headphone and Susvara, where things just started to run out of puff. I have to say, for normal volume levels, it did an admirable job with the Susvara for an all-in-one, but it's definitely not optimally driving those headphones because they're incredibly difficult to drive well. So power output is absolutely no problem for headphones from the Mini i3 Pro, but there is a major fly in the ointment, kind of two flies in the ointment, but one of them cancels out the other, and let me explain what that is. So first of all, you've got a hiss coming out of the Mini i3 Pro if you're using very sensitive IEMs. So with multi-balanced armature, something like the 64 Audio U12T, for example, this will produce a very low level hiss. It's not such that it gets in the way if you listen to music, but in quiet passages, you may find it does become audible again. The hiss though does get kind of cancelled out as a problem though, because there is another issue, and that is that the output impedance from the Mini i3 Pro's headphone stage is pretty much unacceptable. Single-ended output impedance is 11 ohms, and the balanced output therefore is 22 ohms, or just under. It's like 10.8 ohms or something from the single-ended, and therefore 21 point something from the balanced. Those output impedance figures mean that any IEMs, particularly balanced armatures, as well as any dynamic headphones, are likely going to be affected in terms of their frequency response and their general responsiveness from the Mini i3 Pro's headphone stage. Planar magnetics are less affected by that, but there may still be a slight alteration in kind of the snappiness and the drive due to damping factors. That's an area where I still haven't gotten a clear answer or been able to clearly tell if it does make an impact or not, but certainly with dynamic driver headphones, this is going to be an issue with anything below about 150 ohms or more, I'd say. The reason for that I've covered in a few other videos, but in case you haven't seen them, let me briefly explain it here too. If you've heard this before and you understand it, you can use the chapter button to skip ahead. When a headphone amp has higher output impedance, like the Mini i3 Pro does, it means that it's going to deliver power in a different way depending on the impedance of the headphone. Now, as you get higher and higher difference between the output impedance of the amp and the headphone you're driving, so for example, if you're driving a 300 ohm headphone, the big difference between 11 or 22 ohms and 300 ohms means you're not going to have a big difference. But as that difference starts to get smaller, so say you're driving a 32 ohm balanced headphone from the 22 ohm output impedance, you're going to impact the way power is delivered from the amplifier, and the end result of that means that at different frequencies you're going to get more or less power than you should from the Mini i3 Pro. How that plays out is that you get a frequency response that changes from what it's intended to be. The reason for that is that almost every dynamic driver has a variable impedance across the frequency range. So it might be quoted as a 32 ohm headphone, but it might dip down to 24 ohms in one place and up to 60 ohms in another place. So as the frequency changes, so does the impedance of the headphone. How that interacts with the amp is that at certain impedances, the amp is going to find it easier to deliver power and therefore is going to deliver more power. At other frequencies, it's going to find it harder to deliver power and therefore is going to deliver less power. So to use some random numbers to illustrate that, you might find a particular 32 ohm headphone paired up with the balanced 22 ohm output of the Mini i3 Pro. You might find that at 100 Hz, for example, it's receiving a, say, 1 milliwatt signal, but then at a high frequency, maybe it's only getting 0.8 of a milliwatt. All of a sudden, instead of getting exactly the right frequency response at those two frequencies, the 100 Hz is now getting boosted like you've applied an EQ, and the higher frequency is getting cut like you've cut it with an EQ. Sometimes that can result in better sound, but often it takes the headphone away from how we want it to sound because we bought it because of how it's meant to sound. The other thing that happens when you've got high output impedance is that it changes the ability of the amplifier to effectively start and stop the driver. And so what you'll normally find is that the driver becomes looser in its movement, and that will result in a looser, flabbier sound. Again, that can sometimes be a good thing if you've got a very highly strung headphone that needs a bit of softening, but if you've got a headphone that you're already happy with, it may not be beneficial. If you take a look at most products on the market, not all, but most products on the market, they'll generally have output impedances of 1 ohm or below. And that's really the ideal in today's world of low impedance headphones. If you're only using 300 ohm, 250 ohm, 600 ohm headphones, there's absolutely no problems with the Mini i3 Pro, and everything I've said becomes a bit irrelevant. Likewise, if you're using planar magnetics, as long as they're not too difficult to drive like a Susvara or an HE6, If it's a normal everyday planar magnetic, this will also be quite satisfactory because those issues with frequency response don't apply to planars. And that's because planars have a consistent resistance across the entire frequency range. If it's a 32 ohm planar, it's 32 ohm at 20 Hz all the way through to 32 ohm at 20 kHz with no changes. So that's why planars are not as affected by output impedance. The damping factor may or may not have a small part to play, but it's not a big enough issue to worry about in my experience, so planars are going to be okay with the Mini i3 Pro. For dynamics, you need to know if you like the sound of your dynamic headphone with a high output impedance device. So to me, that's a really big fly in the ointment from the Mini i3 Pro. And that means that for me, I would recommend this device only as an all-in-one for planar magnetic or high impedance headphone users. If you're using lower impedance dynamic headphones, you should really only think of this as a DAC and streamer unit. Of course, at a pinch, you can use the headphone outputs, you might get good results, but there's no guarantees. And if you're spending $1,000 odd US, you kind of want to know that it's going to perform well with your specific headphones. And so that's one part of why I don't think all-in-ones are the future. Imagine if you'd bought this as an all-in-one thinking this was all you needed, and you suddenly found out that it changed the tonality of the headphones you plugged into it. Now all of a sudden, your all-in-one is a bit of a downgrade in terms of sound. And that's where an external amplifier that you could switch out if you weren't happy, I think is a better idea. But we'll talk more about that soon. I've got one more gripe to talk about before we turn things positive and I tell you what I love about the Mini i3 Pro. And the final gripe is the USB implementation. It's not that it's a bad implementation, it's quite fine, it's quite good. The issue that I have with the USB implementation here is that when it's not selected, the USB stage is switched off. Now that might be to reduce noise getting into the system through the USB circuit, I'm not sure, but it's a really annoying feature that drives me a bit nuts with products like this. If you're in a situation where you're sometimes jumping between streaming, using USB, whatever the different inputs might be, you need to switch it back to USB before your computer even starts to see it again, and that creates a lag every time you want to switch. It's not a big deal, but I think it's just a shame that the USB can't stay visible to your PC when you're maybe streaming, using Bluetooth, whatever the other source might be. So that's one other minor gripe that I did want to mention when you're using the Mini i3 Pro. The good news is, I think that's the end of the gripes, and everything from here is about good performance and a really enjoyable unit. And I want to start off with a positive that may or may not matter to you, but I find the Mini i3 Pro to be a great looking device. I think the design is stylish, I love that it's very compact, the display as I've already mentioned is fantastic, the interface is great to interact with through the control knob here. It is a shame that the settings button's on the back and not on the front or the remote control, but beyond that, I think it's a wonderful, wonderful piece of industrial design. I love the silver finish around the front panel, the display is beautiful, it really just speaks to being a high quality device that I love interacting with. Another really cool thing that's relevant to the front is that if you do happen to be using the headphone outputs and if you're using the variable line output, all of them have independent volume control. So it's going to remember where you left the volume last time when you were using the single-ended versus the balanced versus the outputs on the back. And that's really, really cool if you do want to have multiple different devices plugged in, and particularly if you're regularly using the same sorts of devices. So the combination of the fact that it's intelligent with the memory of volume, the fact that it's got so much versatility in terms of inputs and the output options of having variable or fixed line outs, all of that to me makes this a really compelling device even without having the perfect headphone stage. And so of course that brings us to the question of how does it sound? A part of that question is a little bit hard to answer because it does depend on the filter that you're using at the time you're listening to it. So like many of the Sabre-based DACs around, the Mini i3 Pro does allow you, and the Mini i3 as well I assume, does allow you or do allow you to actually choose the filters that you're using. There are multiple to choose from. I'm not going to suggest which one's better or worse or right or wrong, but for my listening, I personally prefer the fast linear filter, and I'll explain the reason for that shortly. What's nice is that each of those filters does just very slightly tweak the sound in terms of the sense of attack from the sound and also the sense of space in the soundstage. So you can really tweak it to suit your system and your personal tastes with just subtle changes through those filters. Part 2 of answering how this device sounds is that I then need to split up whether we're talking about the headphone outputs or whether we're talking about the DAC output. So let's start talking about the headphone outputs. The headphone outputs from the Mini i3 Pro are pretty good, I'd say, for an all-in-one. They're probably about on par with something like the RME ADI2 in terms of headphone output. I'm not comparing the DACs here, just the headphone amplifiers. And that also puts it in line with things like the Geshelli Airish amplifier, if you're talking about the balanced output, and also things like the THX 789 amplifier. So it's a good mid-level headphone amplifier output. It's certainly not a level of quality that's up there at, say, a $1,000 headphone amplifier, but at the same time, you shouldn't expect it to be, because the headphone amp is just one part of a $1,000 unit. And this once again raises for me the reason why I don't think all-in-ones are a single solution or the future of headphone listening. And that's because you're always making a trade-off when you're buying an all-in-one like this. The headphone stage is stuck inside a single chassis, so you can't swap it out if you don't like it or you want to upgrade it. And it's sharing its power with the DAC stage, in this case the transmission stage as well for the Wi-Fi and the Bluetooth. It's always going to be a compromise because you've got limited space and you've got to share power and share resources and potentially share noise with other parts of the system. So it's great for convenience, but I don't believe it's the answer in the future. As to specifically how the headphone amp stage sounds, given some of those compromises we've just spoken about, I'd say it sounds pretty good. As I said, it's on par with things like a THX 789 or a Geshelli Airish, which is not to say it sounds the same as those. It's to say that in terms of overall quality level, it sits at about the same level, but it has its own character. And that character is a slightly warm, slightly rich sound. Even putting aside the output impedance issues, I did quite a lot of my testing of this with planar magnetics, so that wasn't going to be an issue. And even putting aside those output impedance issues, the sound is still slightly smooth and slightly rich. It's not really thick or muddy, but it's not a lean, neutral type amplifier. It's got a bit of character to it. That might be good, that might be bad. It's going to depend on your taste and your headphones. And that's also the reason why I said before that I like the linear fast filter on the Mini i3 Pro. The linear fast filter brings just a little bit more attack to the sound, and it helps to make the headphone outputs sound just a little bit snappier and a little bit more resolving. So the headphone outputs, if you've got a headphone that's going to be suitable for the high output impedance, it's an average to good headphone amp. It's not great. There's also, as is often the case, a bit of a difference between the single-ended and the balanced output, where the balance provides a little bit more separation, width in the soundstage, and general sense of space. Comparing it to something like the Burson Soloist, which is a $1,000 headphone amp that does none of the other features of the Mini i3 Pro, you definitely hear the difference between something like an all-in-one like this and a standalone headphone amp. The Soloist clearly shows itself to have much more separation, resolution, detail retrieval, but you'd also expect that because it's a much more expensive headphone amp. I mentioned the Geshelli Airish before. That's a $300 headphone amp off the top of my head, and so that's more in comparison with what you're getting here, and I felt like the balanced output from the Mini i3 Pro was maybe just a tiny bit better than the Airish, so you're getting something in the realm of a $300 to $400 headphone amp when you buy the Mini i3 Pro that also happens to have all of the other features that come with it. A really key part of those other features is the DAC stage in the Mini i3 Pro here. So this runs off an ESS Sabre DAC chip, and it produces a really great sound as a DAC and preamp. To test out the DAC stage from the Mini i3 Pro, I put it up against the Burson Composer DAC, which is also an ESS Sabre based DAC. Comparing the two side by side, both using the linear fast filter, I would say that the Mini i3 Pro stacks up pretty well against the Composer. It's not quite as good as the Composer, but it comes very, very close. Now it is worth mentioning that I had to volume match the Composer to the Mini i3 Pro, which did mean bringing the volume control into the output chain of the Composer and therefore slightly downgrading the signal quality. So if you're able to use a fixed line output from the Composer, it is a decent step ahead of the Mini i3 Pro, but it also doesn't have a headphone amp built in, albeit a slightly flawed one, and it definitely doesn't have streaming capabilities. So to me, the DAC stage of the Mini i3 Pro is really where the value lies. The headphone stage is decent, but it's flawed. The DAC is excellent, and that's great because it's going to be paired up with the streaming functions and allowing you potentially to run this more as a DAC and streamer, less worrying about the headphone outputs and more so fitting it to a high quality headphone amplifier, power amplifier, or active speakers. In that sort of a role, I think the Mini i3 Pro absolutely excels, and I love it in that sort of situation. As a DAC using the XLR outputs, the Mini i3 Pro has a good general width to the soundstage, not a huge amount of depth, but a decent sense of space overall. I'd say it has a slightly warmer than neutral sound because it seems to place a slight emphasis in the mid-bass and the mid-range areas. That does impact its sense of resolution and detail slightly, and that's where something like the Composer did pull ahead, particularly if I was using a fixed level output. But even volume matched, where it does degrade the Composer slightly, you could hear the difference that this was a slightly thicker, warmer sound. It's not overly thick or overly rich, but it's not as truly neutral as something like the Composer can be. So in my listening, I found that the Mini i3 Pro as a DAC, whether it's fed by the streamer or the USB, and I'll talk about that in a moment, the DAC itself I think is a good, slightly above average DAC. It's got that slightly warm, slightly mid-bass, mid-range emphasized sound, but very, very slightly emphasized. And whilst it lacks the absolute best in textural resolution and overall transparency, it's still very, very good, particularly given all that you're getting at the price. I tried it briefly with DSD versus PCM, and I did find that, as is often the case with Delta Sigma DACs, the performance improved just slightly feeding in a DSD signal. So if you are in a position where you can feed it a DSD signal either through the USB or the RJ45 streaming or Wi-Fi streaming, if you can feed it DSD, you're going to get ever so slightly better sound. The sound has just a little bit more refinement, a little bit more blackness to the background I found, and it does allow it to sound like a slightly better quality DAC. It still doesn't quite match something like the Composer, because again you can do the same thing with the Composer for the same type of benefits, but it does improve it slightly within its own capabilities. And so at this point what we've got is a very good DAC with a flawed but reasonably good headphone stage, and I haven't even touched on the streaming capabilities yet. So let's talk about that now, because there's a couple of things worth mentioning. One of them is I wanted to test whether the sound quality varied when feeding USB inputs versus feeding the streamed inputs. So when comparing a stream from Roon using RJ45, the network cabling, direct into the Mini i3 Pro, I found that the sound was maybe a little tiny bit different from the USB input, but not enough that I would actually say it's worth worrying about. And that's great. It means that whether you're using it as a streamer or a direct connected DAC to your PC, Mac, whatever it might be, you're going to find yourself getting excellent quality sound. Any differences that I heard were small enough that they're not worth worrying about and may not even have been real. In other words, they may have just been a bit of placebo or bias, not that I had expectations of one being better or worse, but sometimes we hear things because we're wondering if there's a difference. So it's that small of a difference that it's not worth worrying about. And so all of a sudden we've got ourselves a unit here that is a very capable streamer with this wonderful display that comes up when you're feeding it either from Roon or from AirPlay, and it provides you with on-screen album art, sample rates, the name of the track, the album, the artist, everything you could want, and the display is also variable in terms of the background, so you can have it look as flashy and interesting or as simple and clean as you like. That for me is the icing on the cake with the Mini i3 Pro that makes this a real winner. But there is something to be aware of. When you're running the Mini i3 Pro from Roon as a Roon endpoint, you're getting absolutely perfect quality sound. But if you are looking to run it as an AirPlay device, you're going to get degraded sound quality. I've not played around a lot with AirPlay, but I know using it through Roon, if I choose this as an AirPlay device instead of a Roon Ready device, I did notice that the sound quality dropped quite significantly. It was still good, it was still listenable, but it was definitely not to the level that it could be using a direct USB connection or using the Roon Ready connection. Specifically what I noticed was that in flipping over to AirPlay, I lost a sense of space in the soundstage, so things closed in quite a bit. And the overall resolution of the track, the sense of details and textures, was also slightly reduced, and in a large enough way that it was clearly noticeable. So do be aware, if you want to buy this, it's probably best used as a Roon endpoint, probably not so good as an AirPlay device. Unless you're only looking at it for convenience with AirPlay, in which case it's great. It's seamless, it's easy to use, it works perfectly. But if you're looking for maximum sound quality, do think of this as a device that either needs a wired DAC input or you need to be using it with Roon. So we've covered a lot of ground. Thank you if you've watched this far. I hope you found this informative. And let me sum up now by telling you where I've landed after spending lots of time and flipping back and forth quite a bit as to how I felt about the Mini i3 Pro. And where I've landed is that I love this as an all-in-one streamer and DAC. The headphone amp stage is nice to have, but it's not a thing that I think is particularly valuable in the overall product package. I'd much prefer to have this sitting with an external headphone amp of slightly higher quality, and therefore if Matrix made this without the headphone amp stage and reduced the price a little bit, I would be going absolutely nuts over it. As it is, I think it's a really good device with certain use cases that it's going to work well for and others not so much. As I said before, if you're running planar magnetic headphones or high impedance dynamics, it's a great all-in-one system. If you're using lower impedance dynamic headphones though, the headphone stage is not going to work well for you. Where I really see this excelling is in driving active speakers as a standalone streaming preamp unit. That's where the Mini i3 Pro for me really excels, when it's able to feed a headphone amp or a power amp and act purely as a DAC preamp streamer. So if that sort of use case works for you, I do highly recommend the Mini i3 Pro. If you're looking for an all-in-one unit, it may not be the best choice depending on the headphones that you're using it with. And personally, I'd probably consider other solutions such as a Raspberry Pi as your Roon endpoint, and then connecting that to something like an all-in-one DAC amp, maybe something like the Topping EX5 that I've got behind me, and I've got the review coming for that very soon. Something like that with a Raspberry Pi is going to result in probably better overall sound quality than the Mini i3 Pro here. You'll also happen to come out slightly ahead on cost. So it is a shame that they haven't optimized the headphone amplifier here to work with everything, and it does reduce the versatility of this for every possible person out there. But as a DAC, streamer, preamp, all-in-one unit, I think it's absolutely brilliant if you kind of ignore or just look at the headphone amp as a bit of a throw-in bonus. If that's of interest to you, I'll put a link down below through to Apos Audio. As I said before, they are an affiliate, so I will get kickbacks for any sales made there, and I really appreciate that. Hopefully this has also demonstrated to you that even when products are given to me with kickbacks involved through affiliate links and the like, that it doesn't in any way influence my opinion or my ability to say good and bad things about the product. This is a great product within its own niche, and it's a poor and flawed product in some other ways. So as always, I hope you found this review useful. If you have, make sure you subscribe. Also, don't forget about the giveaway of the Galaxy Buds Live. If you've got ideas for merchandise, put them in the comments down below to get yourself in the draw. For now though, let me leave you to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.